Welcome back to our class on the book of Proverbs. Hopefully this week there are no last-minute technical difficulties and everyone can see this video at 7:30 on Wednesday when it's premiering as it's supposed to. But we are getting close to the end of our study of the book of Proverbs, at least this time around. I'm sure we'll come back to it at some point. But I want to go ahead and jump in. This is the second to last class. And we are talking today about the limitations of wisdom. And in just a second, I want to kind of put this class in the context of everything that we have been studying up to this point. But notice that we're almost done. Next week will be a review. And then the first Wednesday in December, we are beginning again our in-person Bible classes on Wednesday night at the church building. And so we'll start a new class then. I want to do a review to start out. And so we actually have done this before, so you should be aware of these questions and hopefully know the answers to them. But it's just a true-false, and I'll give you maybe 30 seconds to look over these, and then we'll go over each of these. Again, true or false review questions about the book of Proverbs so far. Okay, let's go over these. And remember, they are sometimes tricky on purpose. So hopefully it didn't trip you up too much. But first one, the wise man realizes that the only source of wisdom is God's word. Remember that in Proverbs, as in the rest of the Bible, but especially in Proverbs, that's false because God's word is not the only source of wisdom. There is wisdom to be gained in observing nature or listening to your wife or listening to wise counselors. There is wisdom in all different sources, all different places, but second one, all wisdom originates with God. That is true. All wisdom is God's wisdom, and He has planned that we would receive that in various ways, including, of course, and maybe most certainly, His Word. Reproof of a wise man is never necessary. I mean, he's wise. Why would you need to reprove him? No, that's false. Being wise is more about how you receive that reproof. The wise man is known for his ready answer to every question. No, in Proverbs, the wise man is oftentimes silent, considering what it is that he should say, and maybe sometimes say nothing at all. The fool is known by his stupid look and inability to express himself. No, in Proverbs, the fool is very good at expressing himself. In fact, he delights only in expressing his own opinion. Riches and popularity are the primary rewards of wise living mentioned in the book of Proverbs. That, of course, is false, although the Proverbs do talk about riches and popularity being among the rewards that come to a person who lives in accordance with wisdom. Proverbs have much to say about a hope for life after death. That also is false. There are just a few passages in Proverbs that seem to refer to life after death, but even those are fairly confusing when you look at them. Life and death in the Proverbs often refer to a quality of life rather than actual living or dying. That is true. The way of life is a way, it's a quality, it's a living that is full, blessed, secure, and the way of death ends in physical death and maybe even a bigger sort of death or more ultimate sort of death afterward. But all the way there, it is life of misery and trouble and thorns and darkness and stumbling, so on and so forth. So qualities of life that are being contrasted in Proverbs. The Proverbs picture God as very distant from the hearts and affairs of men. No, remember, God weighs the hearts, He weighs the attitudes, He knows all things. And then the real reward for wisdom is that we can live as much as possible in harmony with God and His creation. and that is true. Remember Proverbs 8, Proverbs 3 also has one statement along these lines. Proverbs 8 elaborates on it, that wisdom was there in the beginning with God. God created the world through wisdom. Wisdom is woven into creation, and so when we live by wisdom, we are living in harmony with nature and with God himself. And that's really largely what Proverbs is all about. Okay, so these are some of our foundational principles that we have just talked about and have been talking about throughout. Wisdom is something we can get. There is one origin of wisdom, that is God, many sources of it, from experience to nature to people, etc., mistakes, others' mistakes. But wisdom is something we get. But wisdom is something also that we are. We can have a wise character, which means that we are receptive and humble and eager to listen to get more of that skill of living well, whereas folly is defined in Proverbs as resisting that learning and that instruction. The motivations for wise living are varied in that there is long life, there is health, there is prosperity, there is social standing or friends and social security, not that kind of social security, but security in our relationships and positive marriages and family, so on and so forth. Those are the rewards of wise living laid out in Proverbs, and yet it all comes back to the knowledge of God, living in the fear of the Lord, and being, as we said earlier, in harmony with him and fellowship with him. That's really the true reward. And there are two paths, one of wisdom, one of folly, one of blessedness, and one of brokenness. Okay, all that then fairly well sets up what is the basis of this lesson on the limitations of wisdom. You'll notice that on your handout, which can be accessed on our website, bellarchurchofchrist.org, under Media, Bible Class Material. The introduction on the handout says, okay, wait a second. Proverbs paints a picture that is very neat, very cut and dry. You do this, it's going to work out really well for you. You do this other thing, it's going to turn out badly. It seems very simple. It seems like, okay, then we can just figure out how to live. We can implement that wisdom and everything's going to be fine. Nothing to worry about. And I can get a hold on life. I can grasp life and control it for my own purposes. Remember we talked about in last week's class, I can be in charge of my destiny, be in charge of my life, and steer it the way that I want to for my own good. Okay, that maybe would be one implication we draw from the book of Proverbs. But we know that that simplistic understanding does not fit with our experiences in life. So what's the problem here? And that's largely what we are setting out to discuss in this week's class. And so our goals for lesson 11 are to show that man's wisdom, even when guided by the wisdom of the book of Proverbs, still does not answer all of his questions or produce a perfect world. It can only go so far, we might say. We want to show that. And we want to show that there is a lesson to be learned. There's something that we should gain, something very profound that we should learn when we think about the limitations of wisdom and the incompleteness and the imperfection that is always present in the world. Okay, so those are our goals that we're going to set out to accomplish. But remember that in the larger context of the wisdom literature in the Bible, there are other conversations, or there are more voices in the conversations that help us to get a more complete picture of living well or living wisely. And that Proverbs, for the most part, does play the role of explaining how we are to live well, wisdom for living our best life. That sounds a little bit too much like your best life now. Maybe tonight's lesson will help us steer clear of that sort of misunderstanding. But Proverbs is about, here's what you do to live well in the present age. But when you take into account the fact that there are imperfections, there are limits, and there is this thing called chance, where sometimes things just don't work out at all the way you think they will or want them to, and there is disappointment no matter really how hard you try to do things well. There is always disappointment. Everyone dies. Things go round and round. Things are always the same, so on and so forth. That's the book of Ecclesiastes, another voice in the wisdom literature. The vanity, the hevel of life. You try to grasp a hold of it, but that hevel is like vapor, smoke, and it's always hazy and never able to get a handle on it. Also, though, we are familiar with tragedy, calamity, injustice, horrible things that happen to people, even the best of people. And so we have the book of Job to add his voice to the conversation and to show that things often just seem totally senseless. And yet God's wisdom is above man's wisdom, and there are things that we will never understand, and we just have to put it in his hands. But all of this, all of the wisdom literature really comes back to this one thing, the fear of the Lord. We've seen that in Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That is the starting place for living well. But even in Ecclesiastes, when all is said and done, in chapter 12, this is the end. Fear God, keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. This is what it means to be human. For all of its imperfections and all of its limitations and all of its frustrations, what it means to be human is to fear God, to keep his commandments. And then Job, of course, in the hymn for wisdom, in the middle of the book, everything centers on this. Where do we get wisdom? Okay, wisdom is in the fear of the Lord and to turn away from evil. And so the different perspectives on wisdom in the Bible collection of wisdom literature really all come back to or are grounded in the same thing, which is the fear of Jehovah. Okay, but even in the book of Proverbs, so Proverbs is one voice in the conversation. We want to be aware of that and understand that. But even in Proverbs, we will see that things are not right. They're not all right. And there are things that are very wrong or off about the world. And we're going to go through these things one by one, at least most of them, and notice these things. But the things are not good all the way, absolutely, perfectly. There is evil. There is disappointment. There are things that just don't make sense. There are things that aren't fair. And things that are we just can only really, stand in awe of or laugh at. Things are not right in the world. And Proverbs, even Proverbs, for all of its cut and dry simplicity, even Proverbs admits that things aren't right. So let's look at some of these things. Nothing's perfect. That is, nothing's absolutely good. And so honey, the sweet, wonderful things we get to enjoy, back to our class last week on gluttony. Good food, sweet tasting things. If you're full, that honey is no longer good. And so even something sweet and pleasant has its limitations, and after a certain point, it's no longer pleasant. Blessing your neighbor. Good morning. We've probably all experienced this, and I've probably done this to my wife or others. Real loud and jovial in the morning. Well, oftentimes that's actually more annoying than it is encouraging. Okay. Singing songs, that's wonderful, but if someone's heart is heavy, those songs are really frustrating and maddening. Or laughter, we think of being such a wonderful human experience, and yet maybe we've all experienced that even in laughter, there may be this hole, this grief, this incompleteness, this something that is just not perfectly good, even in its best moments. Life and its pleasures fall short of satisfying completely. And the Proverbs, again, in these various places, is willing to admit that. Okay, so nothing's perfect, even the good things in life. Nothing's absolutely good. There is also evil in the world. The Proverbs are aware of that, and they admit that as well. 29:2, when the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. 29:10, bloodthirsty men hate a man of integrity and seek to kill the upright. And so these two passages just say they are observing the fact that unfortunately there are wicked people that rule. Proverbs gives plenty of wisdom for how to rule, but it also recognizes that oftentimes wicked people are the ones in charge. And when that's the case, people suffer. That's just a reality of life. But even individual people, all of us, as the Proverbs would say, 20 verse 9, who can say, I have kept my heart pure, I am clean and without sin? Proverbs recognizes this thing that the Psalms recognize, that the prophets recognize, that Paul will emphasize, for instance, in famous passages like Romans chapter 3. No one is clean, no one is pure. All have tainted themselves through wickedness. And the Proverbs admits that as well. And then a few verses earlier in chapter 20 and verse 6, many a man claims to have unfailing love, but a faithful man who can find? Who really is faithful all the way through? Again, we are struck by that in our own experiences, especially when we are disappointed by people letting us down. We say, is there anybody faithful out there? Proverbs says the same thing. Are there really those out there that are 100% completely faithful? Who can say, I have kept my heart pure? There is evil in the world, but there's also sorrow, disappointment, and imperfection. Again, these are some of the sobering observations of the book of Proverbs. These first three, about a heartache that crushes the spirit, or the devastating effects of a crushed spirit. And notice, for instance, like in 17:22, just as an example, a cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. In one way, this sort of contrast reminds us of the two qualities of life. There's a quality of life that is wonderful and blessed. There's a quality of life that is miserable. And so maybe we would think a verse like 17:22 is describing the way of wisdom and the way of folly. But that's not what it's saying, and we know that that's not the case. It's not saying, oh, well, wise people are cheerful, and that's good medicine to them, and foolish people are crushed in spirit, and that dries up their bones. No, it's just to say that, yes, there are times when we have a cheerful heart, when things are pleasant, and that just makes us feel good. But there are also times when you are facing a tragedy, when you lose a loved one, when you get a diagnosis. A crushed spirit dries up the bones and it sucks out the life, the energy, and the strength that you might have. That's just a reality of life. 13:12, I've always thought to be one of the more powerful proverbs. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is the tree of life. The second part of that, we like that. When you've been waiting so long on something, waiting for a family member to return home, waiting on a baby to be born, waiting to get married, and then you get there, and you're there, and you experience that, and it's a tree of life to have that longing fulfilled. Well, what about the first part of this? What about when that hope is deferred? What about when you're waiting and waiting, and month after month, year after year, what you want doesn't happen, what you're waiting for never comes? That makes, as we all know, makes the heart sick, and it's awful. And Proverbs admits as much and recognizes that that's a reality of life. Death and destruction are never satisfied. Again, that's kind of like an Ecclesiastes sort of thing. Everybody dies, everyone dies. The wheel keeps turning round and round. 14:10, each heart knows its own bitterness, and no one else can share its joy. Yes, when we're joyful, we can't express it. Other people don't understand how joyful we are. But when we have our bitterness, when we have our difficulties, we bear that alone, and it hurts. Okay, so things are hard. There's evil, and there is just the sorrows and disappointments of life. And there are things that just don't make sense. Okay, some interesting proverbs here, 18:17, I like this one. The first to present his case seems right, till another comes forward and questions him. So you ever, want to know the answer to something, and somebody gives an answer, and you think, hey, that sounds pretty good. And the next person speaks up, and you say, oh, wait, well, that also sounds good. That also sounds right. And the point is, you don't always know what the right answer is, and shouldn't be fooled because they're the first or the last person to speak. But sometimes you just don't know. One man pretends to be rich, has nothing. Another pretends to be poor, yet has great wealth. There is maybe something in this proverb to be said for the way that we ought to carry ourselves in our riches or with our wealth. But it may be more than that. It's just saying you don't always know from appearances what somebody or who somebody is. And of course, 27:1 sounds like the book of James, which is in many ways the Proverbs of the New Testament. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth. There are things, the future being maybe the biggest example, things that we have no idea about. They're incomprehensible to us. We don't know them, and we can't know them. And so, again, thinking about Proverbs is not as cut and dry as we would like it to be. There are lots of things that we have no idea about and are too big for us. Okay, incomprehensible things. And then some things that are just unfair or inappropriate. Some of these proverbs are interesting. For instance, 17 verse 8, a bribe is a charm to the one who gives it. Wherever he turns, he succeeds. That, sounds like the kind of thing that's said about living wisely, right? You work hard, you're honest, and things are going to work out for you. And here we are saying a bribe is a charm that you can give and succeed wherever you go. Is he advocating for that? Is he commending people for using a bribe? No, that's not exactly what's being said. It's one of those, again, just an observation about the reality that, yeah, there are people out there using bribes to pay their way through any situation, and that's just an unfortunate reality. It's not fair, but that's the way life is, and the way things go oftentimes. These next few, 14:20, 19:4, 19:7, 18:23, about the fact that rich people get the benefit of the doubt. Rich people have friends. People want to be around them because they're wealthy. Poor people are not given the benefit of the doubt. They are, always treated with suspicion, and they don't get mercy when they ask for it. Is that right? Is that fair? No, it's not. But Proverbs is saying that that's often the way that things go. There are these injustices, we might say, in the world, in a society, and that is that's a fact. Life is not always fair. And then 2014, you may remember this proverb, and it's a good one as well. The buyer, right, going into a situation, going into a shop and saying, no, that's no good, right? I can't believe I'm paying so much for this. But then he leaves and says, look how much, look how little I paid. Look how good a deal that I was able to, haggle for back in there. And so, again, is that right? Probably not. But the proverb writer is honest about some of these things in life that are not fair. Okay, so now you get the sense of the sorts of things that Proverbs says. These are not the majority of Proverbs, but they are there, and we want to recognize that. What I want to do now is actually read, and we've done this before, and this will be the longest of a continuous passage that we've read. I want to read all of Proverbs 30, okay? Because I think, and look for this as we go, I think in some ways Proverbs 30 lays out these things that we have identified. And it may be in some ways one voice towards the end of Proverbs to say, not so fast. And so notice in Proverbs 30 how there are some references to these things that are not right in the world. Proverbs 30, we'll read the entire chapter. The words of Agur, the son of Jacob, the oracle. The man declares, I am weary, O God. I am weary, O God, and worn out. Surely I am too stupid to be a man. I have not the understanding of a man. I have not learned wisdom, nor have I knowledge of the Holy One. Who has ascended to heaven to come down? Who has gathered the wind in his fists? Who has wrapped up the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name? What is his son's name? Surely you know. Every word of God proves true. He is a shield to those who take refuge in him. Do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. Two things I ask of you. Deny them not to me before I die. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. Do not slander a servant to his master, lest he curse you, and you be held guilty. There are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. There are those who are clean in their own eyes, but are not washed of their filth. There are those, how lofty are their eyes, how high their eyelids lift. There are those whose teeth are swords, whose fangs are knives, to devour the poor from off the earth, the needy from among mankind. The leech has two daughters. Give and give. Three things are never satisfied. Four never say enough. Sheol, the barren womb, the land never satisfied with water, and the fire that never says enough. The eye that mocks a father and scorns to obey a mother will be picked out by the ravens in the valley and eaten by the vultures. Three things are too wonderful for me, four I do not understand. the way of the eagle in the sky, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, the way of a man with a virgin. This is the way of an adulteress. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I have done no wrong. Under 3 things the earth trembles. Under 4 it cannot bear up. A slave when he becomes king, and a fool when he is filled with food. An unloved woman when she gets a husband, and a maidservant when she displaces her mistress. 4 things on earth are small, yet they are exceedingly wise. The ants are a people not strong, yet they provide their food in the summer. The rock badgers are a people not mighty, yet they make their homes in the cliffs. The locusts have no king, yet all of them march in rank. The lizard you can take in your hands, yet it is in the king's palaces. The 3 things are stately in their tread. 4 are stately in their stride. The lion, which is the mightiest among beasts, does not turn back before any. The strutting rooster, the he-goat, and a king whose army is with him. If you have been foolish, exalting yourself, or if you have been devising evil, put your hand on your mouth. For pressing milk produces curds, pressing the nose produces blood, and pressing anger produces strife. Okay, let's just quickly notice how some of the points that we've already made, observations from Proverbs, show themselves here, maybe all in one place in Proverbs 30. Notice in verses 7 to 9, we've used this passage before, that he asks for neither riches nor poverty. And why? Why would you not want to be rich? Well, it's because nothing is absolutely good, right? He says, hey, if I have too much money, then it will be a temptation for me to turn away from the Lord and say, why do I need God? I have all that I need. That happens. And that's a danger of wealth. And so wealth in itself is not inherently good. By the way, neither is poverty. He says, I don't want to be poor either, because in poverty, there is a temptation to steal and profane the name of God. Okay. So again, nothing is absolutely good. Nothing is perfect. And that this passage seems to indicate that as well. Verses 11 to 14, there's this list, and it's one of those things that's like, well, why are you telling us this? Okay, but it's just a list of things that are evil. People that curse their fathers, they don't bless their mothers. They're pure in their own eyes, and yet inside they're full of filth. They're haughty, they're arrogant, they are destructive, they're tearing down the needy and the oppressed and the poor. And, you know, is it right or wrong? Well, clearly it's wrong, but it's a reality of life that Agur in Proverbs 30 is identifying and calling out for what it is. Verses 15 and 16. This can be translated differently. The leech has 2 daughters. Give and give. Is give and give the names of the 2 daughters, or is this their cry? Give, give, the leech's cry. The idea is they're taking, always taking. And that leads in maybe to his observation in verse 15 and 16. 3 things that are never satisfied, 4 that never say enough, the grave, the barren womb, land never satisfied with water, and fire that never says enough. Each of these things you see is destructive. Okay, the grave is always swallowing up people, and it never is full. The barren womb is always receiving from her husband, I think is the idea, and never producing anything. Land is drinking up the rain, and yet barren land is never producing anything. These are things in life that just are sorrowful, perpetually sorrowful, disappointing. There's always maybe hope of something being better, but it's never enough. Never enough. The grave is always swallowing up those we love. And fire, the destructive forces in life are always destroying and never stop. Year after year, disaster after disaster, heartache after heartache, on and on it goes. That seems to be the picture, at least in part, of this image. 18 to 20, here in Proverbs 30, 3 things that are too amazing for me, 4 things that I don't understand. The way of the eagle in the sky and snake on a rock. These are amazing things. You think, how does that eagle, stay up there and, doesn't even flap its wings and is going around for minutes at a time? A ship on the high seas, how does it stay afloat? How does it go where it's supposed to go? Maybe most amazing and incomprehensible of all, a young man trying to woo a lady. just doesn't make sense, and you just want to sit back and wonder about it. But there are, I think the point is here, just many things that we don't get, things that are too wonderful, they're incomprehensible to try to figure out and to explain, whether in nature or in human interaction. It's just, you shake your head and say, I don't get it. And then along those lines, things that you look at and you say, these things just don't seem to be right. And there's a question maybe about 21 to 23. What does he mean that the earth trembles and the earth cannot bear up? It could be that these are very powerful things. I mean, how powerful is it when someone rises up from a level of being a servant or a slave, like in Gladiator, I always think in this verse, and becomes, the most powerful person, becomes the king? Or someone, maybe 23, unloved or contemptible, but maybe an unloved woman who finally gets married, how powerful that is when she receives that. But it could also be that these are things that are not right. It's just inappropriate. It's not the way things are supposed to work. And maybe that itself is powerful because we are shook by things. We are struck by things that are just not fair. Could be the point here as well. And then in this last kind of list of verses here, up to 31 at least, all these things in nature that are just, again, amazing, or maybe they're just amusing, right? So whether it's the ants or the lizard, right, or the rock badger, these small things, and yet they have great power. They can work themselves into the rocks and make their home there, or these lizard or spider, depending on the translation. It's so small, and yet it can be right there in the presence of the king, and it's just, man, nature is just so cool. It's so amazing, and even has things that you just have to laugh at, maybe. And maybe that's the idea of this last thing as well. Stately in their stride. On one hand, these things are impressive. Okay, the lion that marches as king of beasts. Okay. But I don't know, I can't help it. Maybe there's some poking of fun going on, comparing the strutting rooster to the king that's going around in his security. Again, these are difficult verses to read and, make an application from. But these are just observations about the way things are in the world. Oftentimes, again, as we said earlier, you can only shake your head. You can only laugh. You can only just stand and wonder about what these things are, how they work, and what they mean. And so, the response maybe to all of this, verse 32, if you play the fool and exalt yourself, if you plan evil, clap your hand over your mouth. Okay, maybe that's the best response, is just to be quiet. And 33, the verse after, we should note, does go on to talk about not pressing an issue, not pressing anger, because that will turn to a conflict or strife. But maybe in general, we could take an application, a picture of just seeing the things in the world that are not right, that don't make sense. Instead of reacting in a way and fighting back, just be quiet. That's sometimes all we can do. But really more than that, we go back to the beginning of chapter 30. Notice how this all was kicked off, and really maybe what the whole point of Proverbs 30 is. And that is to recognize my own stupidity, if I'm allowed to say that, or to say that I don't get it. Who am I to understand these things? Okay. Who is it that can go up into heaven? Who is it that has, like in the book of Job, a very similar passage here, that can wrap up the winds or the waters? Who is it? Is interesting what we, on this side of things, that we understand maybe the point of saying it this way. Who has established the ends of the earth? What is his name, or what is his son's name, if you know? Okay. There is a sense of awe, of humility, in looking at God and saying, okay, God, your word is pure. You are wisdom. You are protection. I don't get it. I'm powerless. I'm blown away by these things and have no idea really in the end what these things are about or what the answers are. I don't know. I don't have understanding. But God, you do, and I will trust in you, is I think what we would say about Proverbs 32 to 6. And you see that same idea expressed really over and over again in the Proverbs. I mean, think even back to a passage central to Proverbs in chapter 3. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. But notice over and over again here in these verses, It's the Lord who works out everything. It's the Lord that works justice. We wait on Him. We're directed by Him. He knows us. He searches us, even our hearts, and He weighs our motives. He knows all things. And so the answer is to not trust in ourselves and what we can accomplish, what we can do, even by wisdom in this life, but in the end to recognize the limits of our ability to know things, the limits of our ability to control things, and to close our mouths and to wait for the Lord, to trust in Him, and to know that He does have it in the answers. And true life is in Him, and we can humbly admit that and lean on Him. And so, for discussion as we close here, how have you seen the limitations of wisdom in your life? We've talked some before in some of these discussions about just noticing the way in our life that wisdom works and that we see the principles of Proverbs working out in our lives. Well, what about this one? How have we seen wisdom come up short? And in the end, it has its limits. And the imperfections and the difficulties of life are too much, maybe, or they're a reality for us. And so how have we seen the limitations of wisdom in our life? And how, maybe, has that, or maybe how should that produce more humility in ourselves before God? So if you're with other people, take some time to discuss this. I'll leave it up on the screen for a while, but class is over, and we have one more class lesson next week. Next Wednesday it will premiere, and that will be the review of the book of Proverbs. Thank you so much for watching this week.